You may be seated today. Sometimes, I don't know if you ever do this, when you look at a massive need, it's almost discouraging. When you see it and you think, when you see something, you think, man, something needs to be done. But then maybe that question comes, but really what can I do about that need? Am I willing to give? Am I willing to serve? But what good is the little that I can do compared to the need that's out there? Unfortunately, often, that feeling results in doing absolutely nothing. Since the need is massive and we may have just very little, what do you do with what you have? Instead, you hope someone with a really big resources will tackle it because you think, well, my resources aren't that big, but someone else's. Instead, we hope for something really big to happen. So what happens is you do that enough times, you learn to ignore the massive, huge needs that are out there. And if enough people decide, what can I do? Or, well, I really can't do much with the little that I have. What difference will that really need? What difference will that really be? The need continues to grow. And I'm afraid that the church, we've been guilty of this in many areas within the church. We see unreached people groups. And the number is large, and we think, well, that's such a large number, maybe someone else will go. Hungry children and families, abortion, kids who need a foster or adoptive home and family, literacy, poverty, widows, addiction and substance abuse, care and counseling for victims of gun violence, outreach to prisons, disaster relief, the special needs community, persecuted believers around the world, the education system. Since the need is so big, we've just thrown up our hands and we say, well, we're just going to leave it to somebody else. We're going to leave it to the government. And then what we do is we gripe and complain because they aren't doing as good of a job as we thought they should. But we do nothing, but we just criticize. See, the story we look at today happened at a key point. Jesus has been leading the disciples for some time, teaching them how to do ministry. Now this time it was their first test. Jesus gave the disciples authority and sent them out in pairs to preach the gospel, drive out demons, and pray for the sick, people to be healed. In Mark chapter 6, verse 12, it says, they went out, they preached, and that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and all that they had taught. The disciples, they were excited that people were coming to faith and people were being healed. The disciples, they were trying to have an alone time with Jesus, but it wasn't working out. They just kept getting interrupted by people who wanted to see Jesus. In Mark 6:31, it says this, because so many people who were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. See, the people, they wanted to be around Jesus. They wanted to see and experience the miracles of Jesus, but there were just too many of them, and finally Jesus said, well, let's just find somewhere and then we can rest. And in verse 32 it says, so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them, and guess what they did? They ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Jesus and the disciples, they got in a boat. They tried to find a quiet place, but the crowds, they were on shore. They watched their boat and they ran ahead. As they passed through town after town, they probably told people, hey, that's Jesus out there. He's here. Let's just come and see. And the crowds, well, they knew Jesus was a great teacher and a miracle worker. And with each town they passed, guess what? The crowd continued to grow. In verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. See, Jesus didn't say, well, let's go, guys. They found us. Let's get away from these people. When Jesus looked at the crowd, he didn't see them as interruptions, but as needy people. So he started to teach. And in this short passage, this is what Jesus demonstrated. He demonstrated the passion for how we should serve other people. Number one, Jesus saw the crowd. There were 5,000 people, okay? That's just men that was counted. So if we look at this, that's 5,000 men, probably 5,000 women. And when you have men and women, husbands and wives, guess what you're going to bring? A lot of kids, okay? So there's probably a bunch of kids running around. So maybe we can guess that there's about 10,000 people here. Could you imagine 10,000 people in this gymnasium? Man, I don't know how many times we could fit. We'd have to probably, I don't know. I would ask Mr. Stewart after the service and just say, how many 10,000 would fill this many times? It's a lot. But he looked past the crowd, and Jesus realized the need. Some animals do fine without supervision. Some, and sheep, guess what? They tend to get confused and wander all over the place. They need a shepherd. So Jesus looked at the crowd, and he saw them as lost sheep. And not only did Jesus see them and realize the need, here's the third thing. The need affected Jesus personally. So when Jesus looked at the crowd and realized the need, guess what he had? He had compassion. He felt their pain so deeply that it became his pain. So the fourth thing is this: Jesus invested his life in meeting their needs. Jesus began to teach them many things, and it's not the only way to meet a need, but it was the way that Jesus chose to minister to that crowd. Especially on that day, the story moves to the disciples. In verse 35, it says, by this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. I'm guessing Jesus knew it was a remote place, probably just by looking around at them, and he probably thought, well, okay, thank you, Captain Obvious. Okay, thank you for telling me we're in a remote place. What the disciples were really saying was, hey, Jesus, this was a great teaching, but guess what? You've said enough for now. It's time to stop, and let's just quit. It's quitting time, Jesus, okay? The disciples even came up with a plan. Verse 36, they said, send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So the people had missed several meals and were really hungry, and the disciples, well, their solution was, let's just send people away so that they can get some food. Now you may be saying, well, Pastor Greg, I don't see an issue with this. Jesus surrounded himself with reliable guys who were thinking ahead, and they were just being practical and realistic. And that's a fair point. But why would you want to be practical and realistic when Jesus is around? Why would you just say, hey, how about we do it this way? Let's compare the disciples' approach to Jesus' approach. Number one, the disciples, they saw the crowd. It's a remote place, it's getting late, and there's a lot of people. So they saw the crowd. Well, that's not very hard. They could see the crowd. Most of us can do that. The disciples not only saw the crowd, well, they took the next step, and they realized the need. Well, these people are hungry. And I don't know about you, but when I get hungry, I get hangry and angry. And there's just, maybe my plan would just be, I wouldn't even send them away. I'd just say, I'm going to eat right now. That'd be my plan, right? But they saw the need. They realized the need. And then their answer was a little different. See, the disciples, their first two steps were pretty good. They saw the crowd. They realized the need. Then the disciples, they got off track. They didn't feel compassion toward the people because they got off track. Instead, they feel overwhelmed by the need. See, there was no way they could possibly feed the people because the disciples, they felt overwhelmed. Rather than feeling compassion, their solution was an attempt to meet the people's need, but instead a plan just to get rid of the people. Maybe you felt that way. You see an overwhelming need, you look at your resources, and then you decide, well, I'm just powerless and I can't do anything about this need. You see pictures on TV, kids starving, living in a hopeless poverty with war all around them. And you hear the statistics of how many children are in the world or even in Arkansas that didn't have a real meal today. You look at the pictures, but the need is so overwhelming that you quickly change the channel or scroll through your news feed. And that's the typical response when you come across a need so overwhelming. You feel that your resources just aren't enough. I need to put some distance between myself and this need. It's just too painful. It's too frustrating to even think about. You hear about the thousands of kids waiting for an adoptive or foster home, but there's just too many of them. How can you possibly make a difference with what you have? So you avoid the conversation and the feelings that you're having. You hear about a need among people overseas who have never had a copy of God's Word. There are millions of them, but there's only one of you. How will your little bit actually matter? See, Jesus understood this tendency in his followers, both then and now. And the disciples, they failed the test, but Jesus was not going to leave his disciples in that condition. A truly great teacher, if everyone, think about this, if everyone in a class makes an F on a test, I don't think the teacher says, well, I need to get some new students because they're all dumb and they're idiots. Right? I don't think a good teacher would say that. I mean, you can laugh about it. I mean, it was supposed to be like, I was kind of hitting you, and then it was like, oh my goodness, is there a teacher that said that? No, there's not. But they would say, maybe I got to teach this a little differently. I'm not going to blame the students. I'm just going to maybe teach it a little differently. And that's what Jesus did in verse 37. He answered them, in verse 37, he answered them, you give them something to eat. That's what he said. Now, the emphasis is on you. Don't send them away. You observed the need. You realized that there was a need. Now, you give something to eat. I love it when I hear parents, they say they're at a red light. And I heard a parent say this a couple years ago, and it says this parent or this child is in the back seat, and this child sees someone that looks like they're hungry. They have a sign that says, hey, I'm hungry. A little bit will help. And the child says, hey, Mom, they have a need. They are hungry. Can you give them money? Now, that would be okay if it was like a 10-year-old boy that didn't have a job, but this child had a job. And I'm thinking, well, if you see the need, then you are moved to do something. Then you take your wallet, you take out the money that you've been earning, and then you give the need, because guess what? God put it in your heart. See, they said to him, well, that's going to take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give them something to eat? Basically, they're saying, how are we supposed to give them something to eat? How are we going to find this much food? See, the disciples are stuck. They're overwhelmed by this need. And in the response, this is what Jesus asks. He says, how many loaves do you have? This is a key question. What do you have? I know this need is overwhelming. I know you don't feel qualified or able to make a difference. But the question he's asking you is, what do you have? Instead of focusing on how you can't make a difference, we got to change the focus on what do you have? He says, how many loaves do you have, he asks. We'll go and see. It must have been an amazing scene as the disciples went through the huge crowd looking for food and asking for food from people. Hey, do you have anything to eat? That would be a weird question. It'd be like, oh, hey, you came to church today. Hey, do you have anything to eat? Okay, there's a lot of people here. Okay, you start going through the crowd. Now we switch to John chapter 6, and we get the rest of the story. In John chapter 6, verse 8, Andrew, Simon's Peter brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Now, I wonder, here's my question. How did this boy volunteer his lunch? Did he volunteer it or get voluntold? Hey, you have food. Give me that food. Like what kind of... How do you take a little boy's lunch? That's really the big question I have is, how does Andrew take a little boy's lunch? Does he just steal it? Does he just grab it? Does he just tell him, hey, this will be really cool? Watch? I don't know. And secondly, why does this little boy still have lunch? I mean, like, school probably is over, right? How has he not eaten any of his lunch yet? And I'm just going to, I don't know the answer. Now, I remember being taught of this in Sunday school class, and I don't have one for you guys, but you remember those felt boards? Like those, they were like that green felt board, and like the teacher would be like, now, we're going to tell you a story about a little boy. And they stuck up this like massive boy, and they're like, this little boy, bam, and you're like, whoa. Is he like 22 years old or something? That's not a boy, that's a man. And then they're like, okay. And then he had loaves of bread, and it's like these big old French bread, bam. And they're like, you're like, oh my goodness. And then he had his fish, and then you put the fish down, and I'm like, that's not a fish, that's a whale. And they're like, man, that's a massive lunch. That's how cool God is. But it wasn't really that big, okay? Like, I think they try to tell it in a way that would be like, oh man, get your imagination going as a kid. And you're like, oh my goodness, this kid had a huge lunchbox. But he didn't really have a massive lunch. And so what we do is, that's not really close to kind of the truth of the matter. Now, here's what we do know is that this little boy had a lunch. Now, the lunch wasn't really big. It was a small lunch. Think about it like a McDonald's Happy Meal, a small lunch that's not really supposed to go very far. But what he does is the bread was most likely 5 little barley loaves, only 1 or maybe even 2 bites, smaller than a biscuit. The fish was probably like sardines. Remember, there's no refrigeration, so they're probably smoked and had been cured. So why did the boy still have his lunch? Who knows? My theory is he probably didn't like the lunch. You know, like kids, you pack them lunch and like, I don't like peanut butter and jelly, Mom. I want to trade it. So they start trading at lunch. And who likes fish? Oh yeah, you start trading what you don't like and try to get something you like. But when you see a need, especially the need this massive, our response is this. It's often as the disciples. We look at the size of the need, and we look at it and we go, man, Lord, I would love to, I just don't have the resources to. And you wonder, well, how can you really make a difference? Jesus is saying, he's saying, stop asking the wrong question. He says, don't tell me what you don't have, tell me what you do have. The question is not, what don't we have? We do that a lot. We say, well, I don't have this. And God's saying, hey, I'm not asking what you don't have. What do you have? What do you have? And so a lot of times, Rachel, can you grab me that bag right there? A lot of times we think, man, we think of like lunch, like, you know, we go to the store and big old bags like this. It wasn't a big old bag. It wasn't a big old bag. And sometimes we want our resources to be like this big breakfast thing right here. We're like, yes, ooh, fudge brownie, that looks good, right? We like this, but maybe our resources are more like this. And when we say, but God, I have this, but really if you gave me this, I could do more with this. And God's saying, I haven't given you this, but you have this. And we look at it and go, I don't know how this can feed all of these people. Because we're looking with our natural eyes what we have. And we say, well, because I don't have this, I only have this, I can't do this. God's not asking you to do this. He's saying, be faithful with this. When the need is great, it's overwhelming. The question is, what do you have? What's in your lunchbox? You look at it and you say, well, it just won't be enough. Well, we got to stop playing the comparison game and acting like we don't measure up but God has instilled something in you. When you surrender your heart to the Lord, your resources may still be here, but when you start saying, you know what, I'm going to be faithful with what I have, then God says, oh, I can work with that now. You may say, well, maybe God can use this to make a difference. One person may say, well, I'm not much of a teacher. I'm not good at it, but guess what? I'm a good listener. I'm a terrible talker. And Jesus answers, well, good, I didn't call you to talk. I just called you to listen. And so maybe you can go to the hospitals and visit people who are in the hospitals and just listen to their need. Go visit some shut-ins that can't make it to church, but they need a good listening ear. Go to the nursing homes and just listen to people. Jesus says, there you go, you've got it. It's just now you discover something that's in your lunchbox. Man, someone may say, well, I'm not a people person. I just don't like talking to people. We're not asking you to join the greeting team. We're just saying, go stuff a bulletin. You don't have to talk to anyone. You can sit in your corner and just stuff a bulletin and put it over here, and then someone else. You don't have to talk to anyone. But God says, hey, how about this? You don't like to talk to people? Well, you can run a camera. You can go in the back, help the lyrics for the online. You can do all of those things. You can host the online service. See, what we got to do is we got to see what we have, and give that to Him. Think about it. I wonder if the disciples thought that one little boy's lunch would do any good. Probably not, but Andrew brought the lunch to Jesus, and Jesus did something with it. He took it, and Jesus then directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. How cool is that? God's like, okay, here's the deal. I want you to put them in groups, and they're like, why are we putting them in groups? I get it. You've been asked to do something crazy. You're just like this. Okay, groups of 1,000, and they're like, okay. And probably like James over here going, or one of the disciples, groups of 1,000 at the end going, well, y'all really ain't getting food, because I saw what's going on here. I hope you're in the front, because they're getting the food. People in the back, I'm sorry. You're probably not. Could you imagine what it looked like? He told them to sit in groups. Jesus said, get them all seated, organize them in groups. We're about to serve a meal. I don't know about you. I'd be like, I don't know how this is going to happen. God consistently does that in your life. God says, hey, risk embarrassment, risk putting yourself on the line where if I don't come through, you're in a world of hurt. Just take a chance. Quit whining about what you don't have, and just let's talk about what you do have. Taking risk is putting your trust into action. Some of you have some of the most valuable experiences in life don't happen when you're just sitting back and waiting for things to be done, waiting for God to move. They unfold when you take the chance and you step out. When you trust God with something completely out of your control. The crowd sat down in verse 41, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, He gave thanks and He broke the loaves. Then He gave thanks to them. Then He gave them to His disciples to set before the people. They also divided the 2 fish among them. Verse 42. They all ate and were satisfied. Jesus took a little boy's lunch. He blessed it and then multiplied it. And then gave it back to the disciples. And guess what? The disciples, they all fed the people. All the people, somewhere around 10,000 people, ate from a little boy's lunch, ate from very little. One person we haven't really talked about much is the little boy. Regardless of how enthusiastic he was about giving away his lunch, well, guess what he did? Someone came to him and said, Jesus needs your lunch. Maybe he thought Jesus was hungry, and he gave him his lunch. Who knows? The point is, this little boy took all that he had. He took all that he had, and he gave it to this man. Despite everyone else being around him, being so overwhelmed by the need, he said, it's not much, but if Jesus wants it, then He can have it. If Jesus wants it, then he can have it. And when he gave that little bit he had to Jesus, it was the seed for a miracle. The Bible never tells us his name. We don't know what happened to him after the story. He might have become a rabbi or a disciple. Maybe he taught thousands of people, or maybe this was his only moment in the spotlight, and no one knew his name or the importance of his gift. See, we don't know, but because he was willing to give what he had, the story made the Bible over 2,000 years later. And it's still talking about it. Who would have thought? They would have said, yes, this story is going to be talked about in Little Rock, Arkansas, to people who don't even speak our language, but they're going to speak in some other language called English. And it's going to, like, who would have thought? So my question for you is this. What's in your lunchbox? What's in your lunchbox? I'm not asking about the size of the need. I'm asking, what do you have to give, and what are you willing to give? Time, energy, talent, passion, money, love. What have you been holding back because the need seems so overwhelming? See, we have a tendency when faced with being overwhelmed, here's what we do nothing. And Jesus says, what do you have? Let's see if I can use that. Are you willing to give what you have? Do it and watch Him multiply in an amazing way for the kingdom. God wants to use you. So what we got to do is we got to get out of the crowd and we got to get in the game. Use what God has given you. Here's the deal. If you're good with kids, I'm going to tell you, hey, work in the early childhood area. Work with kids or in our nursery. If you have a driver's license and you have a good driving record, hey, we got people that want to be picked up that say, hey, I want to come to church. My parents don't come to church, but I can't get to church, and I want to come to church. And guess what? They're calling. I've never heard kids call Pastor Larry so much and say, I want to come to church. But we need people who are going to offer, their license to bring them to church. If you can worship, well, you can join the worship team. If you know how to play the guitar, well, you can play the guitar. If you know how to play the bass guitar, play the bass. You're like, man, where are the drums at? It's not like we're not no drums. We're pro drums. We just don't have a drummer. So if you're like, man, I can keep a beat a little bit and clap better than Pastor Greg, then sign up to be a drummer, because I love people that drum. If you love cleaning, well, guess what? You can help clean. Every Saturday when we set up, we clean the carpets, we clean everything around us. If you're great at fixing things, well, you can fix something because things get broken. Here's the deal. If you enjoy meeting new people, serve as a greeter. If you're good at praying, serve on the prayer team. There are 40 possible places for you to serve. 40. And you may say, well, I can count really good. Guess what? Sign up to be a counter. You're like, what does the counter do? About 10:45 when everyone gets here. It takes about 10:45 till everyone gets here. All you got to do is go 1, 2, 3, 4. You just count and write it on a little piece of paper. And guess what? That's a serving possibility. If you say, well, I just want to stuff a bulletin, and you can do that. There are 40 different possibilities. And if you're like, man, I want to find a place to serve, join us after service for Serve 101, and you can figure out a place where you can serve. Because guess what? There is something for everyone to serve.